Alexander 5, ad infinitum through April 5th, 13,803,104,610 BC. In his teachings, Alexander would refer to this as the second law moment, though he would always point out that in linear time it was the first. He was gone, existing in a state of non-existence, perpetually aloft the nothingness that preceded the existence of space and time. He had no body to speak of, and his mind had gone. At the speed with which he had been observing time, it had taken billions upon billions of years for him to traverse all of history, all while jailed in a self-imposed state of suspended animation, a box that he'd unwittingly forged around himself. So much time had passed that he'd found himself long since devoid of thought, and was little more than a barren mind when he was engulfed by the nothingness beyond the start of time. For all it mattered, he may as well not exist at all, and for time beyond measure, that was the metric by which he was denied realization. He had for the time forgotten that he ever existed, and thus did not exist in a sense. For the first billion years or so, whilst hurtling through time in his frozen state, he had conversed with the voice in his head, which had mostly just scolded him, but finally forgave him for his grievous misdeed. Then, eventually, Alexander forgot that he had someone to talk to, and the voice went away. Then he ran out of things to think of, so he stopped thinking, and eventually his mind all but forgot how to think. And this is how he spent eternity, nowhere as nothing. There was no time in this state of existence, so it is incalculable how long he remained adrift in nothing. All seemed to be lost. Then he had a thought. It was not a definable thought. It wasn't a word or an idea. It was more an acknowledgement of existence. He thought, and therefore he was. He came into being, and with him came the universe. All of the raw energy, the derivative contents of existence that had followed him through time, all of it, along with him, then re-emerged into reality alongside him and throughout him, and the universe was born. It was a great thing to behold, a dazzling display of light so bright its true splendor could not be beheld by human eyes. The universe had emerged from nothingness into the light. There was no longer darkness to speak of. It was only bright, hot, and loud. It was perhaps for the best that Alexander had only a body imagined, and not one susceptible to anguish, for it was incredibly hot, and the pressure was ungodly. Had his body been real, he would have birthed the first fire in the universe, as his head would have burned in a bright flash. As it was, his body was only an extension of his mind, no more or less real than his thoughts, immutable and indestructible. As time went on, it became difficult to discern whether the universe was growing around him, the fringes of space spreading out and unfolding into the cosmos, or if he was in fact shrinking, falling in place, forever slipping deeper into the recesses of where he was already positioned, moving without motion as time passed. His newly reinvented appearance had him looking less and less like Alexander, and more like the towering being that so long ago, or so long from now, depending on one's perspective, had stolen him from his bed and set him on this course. He was aware. He was him. He had returned from nowhere, but he was still alone. Alone in a scorched ocean from which there was no escape in any direction, sentenced to burn, but never to feel it. Again, waiting out the eons, mind all but eradicated. The epicenter of the Big Bang was directly in the middle of his head. The reason that the expelled energy of the singularity which birthed the universe inflated to the size of a fist, faster than the speed of light in the first instant of existence as it did, was because all of his mind had come into being in the same instant. When Alexander emerged from nothing, it was not as though the center of his brain appeared first and then the rest of it grew from there. It materialized all at once. Thus, the singularity which had housed the rest of infinity in a tiny space, infinitesimally smaller than Alexander, came into being inside of Alexander, whose presence demanded the use of space and time despite having no material needs. Therefore, space expanded faster than light in the first moments of creation to accommodate the existence of Alexander, or rather his mind. The universe was his first thought, and that thought had happened inside of what he imagined to be his head. Being that he is part of the universe, equilibrium had to be established. When the Big Bang emerged, the rate of its initial expansion defied the laws of physics because it was forced to by way of mitigating circumstances. As Alexander would later summarize in his teachings, either the universe had to expand into him, or he would have had to succumb to it. And since it could not collapse, pull on, or in any other way affect Alexander's imagined form, the singularity had no choice but to expand to fill the container that his false presence outlined, as space and time were needed to allow for his presence. In short, because the singularity could not attract Alexander, it instead succumbed to the attraction imposed on it by Alexander, and was ripped open to fill the void Alexander represented instantaneously, denying it the gradual growth it might have otherwise experienced had Alexander not been there. This event is what astronomers of the future would eventually refer to as cosmic inflation, as he would reveal in his teachings. During cosmic inflation, space and time receded from the singularity at faster than light speed, essentially instantaneously. Then it slowed to the normal expansion rate experienced in the beginning, having carried with it some of the energy from within the singularity as it expanded, dispersing the energy of the Big Bang throughout the newly defined confines of space, and rapidly cooling in the process. This was the first moment of existence, when the singularity which held captive all the contents of the universe, including space-time itself, was inverted and its guts spilled out. Physicists, mathematicians, and all manner of scientists would, in the far-flung future, come to understand that the brief period of sudden inflation calculated to have followed the Big Bang was evident, but the mechanism which had caused it would forever elude them. None of them would have ever thought that it had been derived from a thought from the mind of an impossible being who existed before the universe, that from which he himself originated. No one would ever conclude that space-time was forced to expand, the ends of the universe stretched, because though all of reality was new, something else was already there, and it had to create room for it. Alexander, though intangible, was there all the same. When the universe sprung from a tiny speck of nothing, Alexander was there, and he could not be there without the employ of space-time. Therefore, space-time had to become where he already was, and the outer edge of reality obliged and reached him ahead of the material from the rest of the emerging universe, allowing the outer confines of the universe to spread into a space the size of a brain, literally before there was time to think, all so that when there was time to think, the thought that had been conceived in the nothingness, Alexander's notion of awareness, was given time to happen. Thus was born the realization of existence. His mind needed space in order to exist, and his thought needed time in order to happen. So space and time there were. However, awareness of his own existence was for him all that there was for a very long time. So though it serves as somewhat of a comfort to know that he had altogether forgotten what it meant to be alone, one must still pity him, for he was alone nonetheless. Again, Alexander was alone. Still, Alexander was alone. Lyellin 11.3, May 8, 1973 AD. Hemhut was beside himself. She had promised him that which she had delivered. They had for 3 years and 1 week enjoyed one another's company in peace. Now it was over, and he cradled her lifeless body close to his chest, sight of it nearly completely obscured by the breadth of his arms. Every day that she lived, he had made her a new headdress, a wreath of flowers. After she fell away from him, the last halo of flowers that adorned her head dried out and lost its color, and soon became indiscernible from the gray of her dead flesh. He could not cry, but he could feel sorrow, and he mourned. He mourned, holding her body in his arms, in the center of their cozy woodland cottage, at the bottom of a well of sadness, for years on end, until her corpse decayed in his clutches and eventually broke apart and fell away. He'd traversed the course of centuries, waded through rivers of blood, all in anticipation of the time promised him by his love. Now it was over. Hemhut was alone. Her final set of instructions, implicitly destructive as they were, did not bother him. He would do all as she asked of him without question. Her final request, however, her final command had broken his heart. He was never to see her again. During her next coming, and for over the course of her final life, she commanded him remain hidden deep in the earth. She commanded him respond only from afar to that which she requested, but to never reveal himself to her, let alone anyone besides. She said that doing so would alter the course of the future they had so carefully crafted together, and that she would end up dead by Daniel Dwyer's hand. So she pleaded with Hemhut as her 11th body died, to please refrain from interfering, no matter what he heard, that he must let her suffer when her suffering comes, and allow the future to be what it must, one where he exists forever in waiting. "I'm going to destroy Daniel Dwyer," she had said between quiet, raspy breaths. "Once he is gone, it will be safe for you to emerge. But by then, I will be nearly dead myself. I am afraid that by the time you reach me, I will either be dead or will have nearly passed. Goodbye, my sweet, sweet, faithful Hemhut. I love you, and I will never forget you." A few staggered breaths later, and she was gone. Justine Henderson's body had gone limp. The 11th life of Lyelan, the life promised to her faithful giant, was done. She was gone, and he would never see her again. Hemhut, who did little thinking for himself, was left with the burden, wrought in desperation of how he might avert this contingency and once again know the touch of his love without disobeying her, and he could not fathom a way. For Hemhut could not see into the future or the past or through the eyes of other beings. Hemhut was just Hemhut. He, after lamenting her passing for several more years, finally laid her withered remains to rest and burrowed deep into the earth. He moved unscathed through the netherworld and came to a stop deep under the mantle, well into the core, and there he remained. And once again, and now forever, he feared, Hemhut was alone.